Good afternoon and welcome to our event on designing the new UN climate finance goal, ambition, additionality and an extended contributor base, ? My name is Stefan Klingebiel. I'm heading the research department Inter and Transnational Cooperation here at IDOS, and I would love to welcome you on behalf of Center for Global Development, CGD, and IDOS, German Institute of Development and Sustainability, here for our event. Just brief introductory remarks, and I want to start with a small anecdote. Yesterday, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, went to southern parts of Germany, and you might be aware that in those parts, Bavaria, some other areas, we currently face a very serious flood. And Olaf Scholz was saying probably many important things, but I want to highlight two. The first thing is he was mentioning this is the fourth time he is visiting a flood situation since the beginning of this year in Germany. So just indicating this is not a usual year. Yeah. And the second thing, and I think we hear it more frequently now, this is also related to human-made climate change. Yeah? And I'm mentioning this small anecdote because we see in Germany, in other parts of the world, those consequences of climate change more frequently. It's visible, it's tangible everywhere, and we know that the consequences are much more severe in developing countries and especially in poor countries. The year 24, and we see it here currently in Bonn, we will see it at the COP in Baku, is very much about international climate finance in order to provide resources for mitigation and adaptation. We know that the $100 billion goal from the COP in Copenhagen 2009 was and is not sufficient, even if this objective was achieved in 22 for the first time, at least according to the calculations of the OECD. We know that the entire approach has to provide and mobilize the resources, and those approaches need to be reconsidered. This applies to the composition of international climate finance, private resources, those public resources coming from ODA. This applies to the allocation objectives, which countries should benefit most, how much for mitigation, how much for adaptation, how much for loss and damage. And it also includes the reporting system. How can we make an incentive system which is transparent and provides really incentives to international climate finance? So in this regard, I think the subtitle of our event is both highly relevant and controversial. So the level of ambition, the additionality aspect, additional to what? ODA, how is the relationship organized? But also the question about extended contributor base. Yeah? Who is expected to contribute something in addition? We know that this will be extremely difficult to find a comprehensive and agreeable response to those challenges. I'm really glad that we have great experience here tonight for our discussion on those issues. I'm extremely pleased that we are co-organizing this event together with our colleagues from CGD in London, so I'm really grateful to Ian Mitchell, to his team, and for this kind of collaboration. But let me also thank on our side, IDOS side, Svea and Maria, who were really leading this process here for IDOS. With this, I would like to hand over to Ian, and looking forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you also IDOS colleagues and CGD colleagues for helping us to put on this event, which has the advantage, because we're outside of the official UN space, of being able to be webcast. So there's a substantial online audience who I think are very interested to hear how the negotiations are going. I'm Ian Mitchell from the Centre for Global Development. Our work seeks to reduce global poverty and improve lives through research, but with an application to policy. And I think this panel encapsulates that. We're going to combine some of the latest research and the findings from it, from hearing the realities of where we are in the negotiations. So I'm really looking forward to getting into discussion. To kick us off, we have Heike Henn, who's Director of Climate, Energy and Environment and Commissioner for Climate Policy and Climate Financing at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. Those of you that know Heike know she's got a very distinguished experience across a range of areas, from research and NGOs, but also at BMZ, where she's had a number of impressive roles, including on the G8 with Africa, and leading German development cooperation in Burundi and Rwanda. Heike, you've been following the negotiations. I'm really looking forward to hearing your remarks. Welcome. What is it that we hope to achieve at Bonn? How important is the NCQG, the new climate quantified goal, to climate ambition? And what progress can we expect?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and for really organizing this event. It's the topic everybody is discussing. Last night, I mean, you were talking about the Chancellor, but also in the German news, what they reported on Bonn was on climate finance and the NCQG debate. So this is obviously the key topic. And what are the contentious issues is basically how much, from whom, for whom, how long, sub-goals, and so on, are rather details maybe than in this room full of elephants, basically. So the role of the SBs right now, and we just started, is really to make progress towards Baku, because there are so many open questions, and we stated quite some time already the different positions. So we now have to make progress, identify what could be bridges, what could be common language, so that we don't spend too much time in Baku in giving more speeches and not really achieving an ambitious joint decision. So yesterday's TED Talk, with also input from CGD, was interesting, because people started talking to each other, with each other, and asking really sensible questions. Okay, we heard also some statements, but it was progress in the right direction. And I have also hopes for the ad hoc working group that will enable us really to get down, talk to each other in more quiet settings, and really develop language. And also settings like today, I think, are important to have an informal atmosphere and also get input from research that should guide us moving forward. So how we can make progress, how can the NCQG look like? I want to make 3 quick points. One is a bit the common ground I see, in some limits. Second is the German maybe position on more difficult questions, on some of the hot potatoes, and then one hidden hot potato from my perspective that I feel quite strongly about it, and it's not only a personal issue, but also from the German position side. So common ground, some key elements I see: the need to scale up climate finance. Everybody agrees that we have to have more international climate finance from all sources. So there is part of maybe the common ground, but also the differentiation. And we need more money for the ambition, for ambitious NDCs, for the transformation, to somehow get back again to 1.5 degrees, for adaptation, loss and damage. And I don't want only to talk about Paris, but also the SDGs and the nexus we need here between climate finance and development impacts. I think most of the parties agree that public funds are a core part of the NCQG. And I would go a step further that the public funds from the so-called global north are an important part. And I think all of us more or less agree that public funds are not enough, that we need public and private sources, that we need national and international sources, that we have to look at the international finance architecture. And this means the so-called onion architecture, different layers of this international climate finance. And there might be some more common ground, but these are like the key elements I see, and this is positive and gives a direction. Hot potatoes are the goal, the number, the millions, the billions, the trillions. Contributor base, vulnerability, for whom, quality of finance, and also looking at Sabine and other sub-goals, talking about loss and damage. So how to approach those? And the German perspective, that is my second point, is first and foremost the climate crisis is a global crisis, and we need climate efforts that are global, and we from the German side are committed to climate ambition and to our international climate finance and a fair share of this. So what I'm saying is not from a position of shying away from really commitment. Second thing of the German position is 2024, 2025 is no longer the world of 92. The economic development, the historic emissions, also vulnerabilities evolve. And so, yes, Germany should in the future contribute, but also other parties, countries that right now are not part of the international climate finance in UNFCCC standards. And on vulnerability, we feel quite strongly that we better need to channel funds towards vulnerable people and countries, talking about ADCs and SIDS, but also marginalized communities, women. So, and the magic number, that is my last point, is we need a number, I guess in the end, for the investment needs from all sources. Montreal, maybe the biodiversity COP gave a hint on what things could look like. And we need also to build on the experiences of the 100 billion goal. And from my perspective, a complex system of sub-goals and sub-targets will not help us, but transparency, monitoring, and a thorough analysis, and then action on this analysis, what works and what not, would help us. So my last point on the hidden potato, from my perspective, or not so much talked about, we talk a lot, is implementation for impact. Yes, finance is a means of implementation, but it's a means for implementation. It's not an objective in itself. So we talk about quality of finance, and rightly so, loans, grants, and other elements. But the quality of implementation, the quality of delivery, the best for people and the transformation, that from my perspective, there's a ton of analysis on the importance of policy reform, ambition in policy reform, and a programmatic systemic approach that goes beyond projects. That is a hot potato. And an enabling environment could leverage much more climate finance than we have right now, and is highly important. And to shift the trillions, I know Article 2.1c doesn't sound good in many ears, but we need to shift to trillions, and we need to create the framework conditions to do so. So from my perspective, really, I personally regard implementation for systemic structural impact as highly underrated and key for ambition. And if I look at Baku and we would solve some of the potatoes I mentioned on the number, on the contributor base, but leave out the ambition for policy change, for transformative change in what we do with the money, then we will fail people, and we will fail the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Heike. There's lots to pick up on there, but I will be patient and we'll move along the panel and hear something. Some of the research which I think will speak to some of the answers to the questions that you've posed for the negotiations. So let me now turn to Svea Koch, who's from IDOS and is a senior researcher in the Inter- and Transnational Cooperation team. Svea has a PhD which covered the effectiveness of EU development policy, and I think to those of us that follow her work, she's a recognised thought leader on global development policy. So your work has looked at the relationship between development and climate finance, and I think it's fair to say that that relationship is far from being well aligned or ideal, maybe especially in terms of reporting. So what does your work recommend in terms of the NCQG and the new climate goal? And in particular, what about the qualitative aspects? And Heike's asked us about impact, so it'd be great to get your perspective on those issues.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think my first recommendation would be to acknowledge the weaknesses of the implementation of the 100 billion goal. So to look back, basically, in order to look forward. And I think it all starts with a lack of a definition of climate finance. And I'm not thinking about the one sentence that is missing. It's not about the one sentence, but it boils down to other aspects. So what we have at the moment is a plethora of reporting practices by donors, differences in what counts and what does not count as climate finance. And some have even called the current system as the wild, wild west of climate finance. And I know it's not easy, and I know that the Standing Committee on Finance has done a lot of work on this, and I know it's a priority for developing countries, as they have made clear in the submissions to the ongoing negotiations. And I think following from that lack of a definition is also the lack of a definition of additionality of climate and development finance. And what we see in studies, no matter the method they apply, is that the increase in climate finance we have seen over the past years has come at the expense of other development priorities, and that overall order volumes have not increased accordingly. And my perspective on this is that the current system creates competition between traditional objectives of development and climate objectives, even though obviously they are indivisible and require integrated policy responses. So the third weakness I would like to highlight is the reporting by OECD-DAC donors. And I think it has been, as I said, written in many studies that the self-reporting done by donors is prone to overestimations and over-reporting. It leads to double and triple counting of the same money, as projects can have several principal and significant objectives. There's also a lack of granularity, that not only the relevant parts of the activity are counted as climate finance. And in general, there's also a problem with counting loans at face value and not on grant equivalent terms, as we see with ODA, for example. So a 300 million loan can count as 300 million climate finance, even though the grant equivalent term is much lower. And in general, these reporting practices have led to an overestimation of the climate finance flows. And I've seen, if we now have seen the OECD coming forward last week, that the 100 billion goal has been achieved and even exceeded, the acknowledgement of that was not what I expected. It was not a lot of acknowledgement, because many know that these numbers are overestimated. That's my view on it. And let me also say that the science is pretty clear about that. It's not my personal perspective. It's no matter what a study you look at it, not matter what the method is, the result is pretty clear. And then the fourth weakness is that the 100 billion goal was an input target. It had little to no emphasis on outcomes and impact. And I think this is also something that needs to be addressed with the NCQG. So my recommendations for the NCQG from this research perspective would be, as I said, to acknowledge these weaknesses in moving forward. And Maria, my colleague, and I have written a paper where we put a lot of thought into how is it possible to balance a separate accounting with integrated policy responses, because nobody would argue to separate climate and development. That's very obvious. And if we assume that the NCQG will be a multi-layered goal and at the heart will be public finance, and I think there's a lot of agreement on that at the moment, the NCQG needs to ensure that the quality of climate finance at that heart becomes much better, more transparent and more reliable. Then the list gets long, it becomes quite technical, but I think the most important elements would be in defining climate finance. As I said, for me it's not about investing a lot of political energy in getting one sentence right. It's about defining climate finance by defining the NCQG and the various aspects of it. And by that, separating climate and development financing in accounting and reporting, also for the sake of additionality. And if we have a heart of the NCQG, that is public finance with potentially thematic sub-goals and adaptation and mitigation, I think the big question is whether loss and damage will be included. I think there we also have different perspectives on the party side. In the future, it should be reported on grant equivalent basis. And I think we've seen this shift under the OECD in 2018, so I think it's feasible. It could be done. In my perspective, the reporting also needs to change, and it can be changed. Projects should only have one principal objective, and it could then be either climate or development. I think it's the current situation where 100% of project is counted as adaptation and mitigation and development is something that needs to be discontinued, and even the OECD Secretariat is calling for that. Then another important point would be to introduce granularity, that only the relevant parts of projects are counted as climate or development finance, and I think this is a practice some donors are currently doing and some others aren't. I think a triangulation of data would also be important, but let me come to my last point. I think the introduction of qualitative frameworks is overdue. And I think in general, there has been a lot of emphasis on this 100 billion goal, and rightly so, but there has been much lower emphasis on the impacts of climate finance. In general, it's under-evaluated. I think your colleagues have also done analysis of this, is that climate finance compared to development finance is really under-evaluated. We don't know enough about the impacts of the money. Multilateral climate funds do contain qualitative frameworks where OECD DAC reporting and also the reporting on the MDBs do not include standardized indicators or methods to get a better understanding of the impact of climate finance. Without such qualitative impact measurement, the whole system is also prone to mis- or overcoding. And if no explanation is required what the expected outcomes of the project is in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction or the increased resilience. So let me conclude that with the NCQG, a quantum leap is required, not only with regards to the quantum, but also regarding the quality of climate finance. Is it reaching the countries, the people that need it, in a form that is useful for them and with the highest possible impact?
Great, thank you so much, Svea. And it's there's a long list of issues to resolve there. And I think what's quite interesting for me is, I mean, how many of those issues have been resolved in the development space? But I think as climate finance matures, 15 years ago it was less than 20 billion, but now it's at least a quarter of global aid. It feels like it's time for the climate finance framework to mature, I guess. Thank you so much. So let's move on to our other research panelist, my colleague Jonathan Bynon. Jonathan's a senior policy associate at the Centre for Global Development with me, but he's had a long career in the UK Department for International Development and its successor as an advisor to ministers on climate. Jonathan, you've been researching fair shares and creating a bit of a stir at yesterday's technical expert dialogue, we hear. So what has that work shown, and what are the implications for NCQG?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ian, and good afternoon, everybody. So the question about the contributor base for climate finance has been hugely contentious. It came up yesterday. It's been coming up for a long time, with sort of two clear camps, essentially. Developed countries wanting to see the contributor base expanded, partly for the reasons that Heike set out. The world is very different today than it was in 1992. And developing countries referring to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities and saying, guys, you created the problem, it's your responsibility to sort it out. It's not for us. And I've been fascinated by that, and I don't at all want to take sides in this. My background is in development and in trying to see poor people in poor countries prosper and grow and develop. But trying to look objectively at all the evidence and the data leads me to the inescapable conclusion that with reference to common but differentiated responsibilities, there is a powerful case for non-Annex II donors to start providing climate finance, maybe 20 to 30% of whatever the total is. So that's the headline finding. Let me explain how I got there. So most people would acknowledge or recognize that responsibility would be in some respects related to your emissions, your cumulative historical emissions, and capacity would be reflected by per capita income. So we constructed a model that essentially combines those two by multiplying cumulative emissions since a certain cut-off date, and our baseline we choose 1979, because that was the date from which there was a very obvious uptick in references to climate change in UN General Assembly discussions, etc., etc. Other analysts have chosen more recent cut-off dates. And we looked at so multiplying that with per capita income. So essentially, and it covers all countries, not just the existing set of 23 Annex II climate finance providers that have a legal obligation currently to provide climate finance. I would argue that that reflects common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, in that two countries with identical historical emissions from your chosen cut-off date would have fair shares directly in proportion to their per capita incomes. So in 1979, it so happens that the US and China, in terms of CO2 emissions, are pretty much identical. But China's per capita income is 1/6 that of the US, and consequently the model spits out that China's fair share is 1/6 that of the US's. That said, the US's share is over 40%, and China is in fact the second, or would be the second biggest contributor in the fair shares model. What we actually do is we have 9 different scenarios using different measures of emissions. So we look at CO2, we look at CO2 including land use change, we look at all greenhouse gases. We look at different cutoff dates. We use the 1991. We also go back as far as 1900 as a potential cutoff date. You could even choose 1850. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference, in fact. We consider the possible discounting of emissions, although we discard that one in our baseline scenario. And we also assess what would the implications be of excluding a whole bunch of countries whose fair share seems to be so small from the poorest countries. And whichever way you cut it, it does appear that the non-Annex II share would be in the sort of 20 to 30% range. Even with a 1900 cutoff date, using CO2 as your emissions measure, 17%, using all greenhouse gases, 23%. So that's the reason why we would argue that there is a very powerful case for a wider set of contributors to any climate finance goal. One more thing, that formulation is actually probably more favorable to, let me call them, developing countries than some of the previous analysis that has been that has been produced. So there have been a bunch of studies that were done that were trying to estimate fair shares, many of them just limited to the existing set of Annex II donors, which looked at aggregate emissions and aggregate income, calculated each country's share of the two, and then just took the average. Had we applied that approach to our data set, you would have had a non-Annex II share just over 50%, and China being the biggest at nearly 20%. So the fact that we come up with figures that are lower than that suggests to me that it's actually quite advantageous to developing countries. So those are the headlines. We've since done, we just published last week, a bit of an update to that model. It does 3 things. First of all, it incorporates the facility to introduce sort of minimum thresholds of income and emissions before you even start counting their contribution to any climate finance share. And it also allows for a more exponential rate to be applied. It's like a progressive tax system, if you like. And clearly that does favour developing countries and puts more of the burden on existing Annex II countries. How much depends very much on the values that you apply to your thresholds and your exponents, but that's the direction of travel. But because I feel quite comfortable that the existing formulation is already, compared to other analysis, pretty favourable to developing countries, I'm not sure that we should delve into that or go too far down that route. The second thing it does is it notes that the fair shares have changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Had we done this analysis in the year, covering the year 2000, the non-Annex II share would have been 12% instead of the 26% that it is currently in this with the greenhouse gases as the main as the main formulation. China's was less than 1% had we done this analysis in 2000. Now it's around 8%. We've built in projections of both emissions and income into the model and said, well, what might it look like in 2030? And unsurprisingly, the responsibility or the share of the non-Annex II countries goes up further. So we're looking at 32% for non-Annex II countries overall. So the trend is clear in that particular direction. By the way, just to be clear, that model also involves a slight tweak. So it looks at per capita emissions, per capita income, and population. So the three elements are all multiplied together. The last thing is that because of the high share attributed to the US in all of these models, I think most people would probably accept that that's unlikely. I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but it probably won't. So we've introduced a facility in which the caps of not just the US, but the shares of any country can be capped. And just to illustrate the impact of that, suppose the US share was capped at 20%, it would imply that the fair shares of everybody else would increase by about a half. So your non-Annex 2 share would go up to above 30%. Conclusions. There's no single, simple answer to this. All of these assumptions can be contested, both on technical grounds and on political grounds. It's not straightforward. It's very clear that developed countries continue to have the primary responsibility and need to be providing a whole lot more money than they currently do in public finance and in grant equivalence terms. But I find it impossible to escape the conclusion that from a fair shares basis, based on common but differentiated responsibilities, there shouldn't be a contribution coming from non-traditional, non-Annex 2 donors. We certainly need to recognize that already such countries are providing, in some cases, quite significant volumes of climate finance that go unreported. And we need to find a way, it seems to me, in formulating the NCQG of both recognizing and acknowledging and encouraging those contributions. And the debate as to whether it should be an obligation or not, I think that's going to be a very hard part of the negotiation, the discussion. But one way or another, it does seem to me that there is a very powerful case for incorporating contributions from non-Annex 2 donors in countries in all this. One last point. Whichever way you cut it, the contribution coming from low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, including, crucially, India, SIDS and LDCs, in all those scenarios, their collective share is less than 2%. So it would seem to me appropriate, at any rate, to say, why don't we just exclude all those countries from any responsibility, any contribution, at least for the foreseeable future in this, because even though it's more than 100 countries, there are 116 countries that fall into those categories. Their contribution, their fair share is so small that from a negotiations point of view, why not just say, you're off the hook? And maybe that would help unlock some of the difficult conversations that are going on and as the NCQG is finalized. But I'd love to hear your reaction.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And as Jonathan said, I mean, the whole model is online. So if there are scenarios that you want to explore, you can do so. You can change the cutoff date and so on. But I think what's really clever about Jonathan's work is to look across different scenarios and think about what they mean collectively. So those were our research inputs. Of course, we researchers live in ivory towers and are completely divorced from reality. So to bring us back down to earth, we're now going to hear from our two climate negotiators. And I'm really pleased we've got them here to hear their perspectives and the latest on the negotiations that are happening. So first, Julius Nbatia, who's an environmental professional and practitioner in climate policy and programming. He's the climate finance negotiator for the African Group of Negotiators and has been for Kenya as well. So I'm really looking forward to your comments, Julius. What is the African Group of Negotiators seeking from this process? And how do you see some of the issues that Jonathan and Sveya have raised in terms of contributor base and transparency?
Thank you for the questions and the introduction, and really interesting to be in this panel. So we live in a reality that would fit us based on where we are, and we might do all that we can to put a defense or an evidence-based engagement, and everything can go whichever way based on discussions based on science, and that's the reality of the decision-making process. But the beauty about the decision-making process is that it looks at what exactly it is that we've agreed on, And we talk about that as mandate, and we talk about as principles and values. And this is the only principles and value-based system that we know that would actually speak to the climate crisis that we are in right now. And so a continent such as Africa being able to engage and participate is important, because then we have to bring forward to you all to understand the realities that we live in. And we live in realities that are very challenging. And just to share a bit of that, Kenya in the last 3 weeks was hit by floods that got half of the country flooded. And we had about 18,000 people displaced and 232 lives, more than 232 lives lost. 5 months before that, we were in drought. So when I hear about the German Chancellor visiting the flood-stricken area, I want to understand that, but then I would want to pose a question around the frequency of that in our own contexts. And this is an additional burden on developing countries, on African states. And we, at the moment, contribute or put forward about 5% of our GDP to deal with climate crisis and climate impacts and loss and damage. And when such a catastrophe happens, it does backtrack our development gains. And these are hardly won gains. And so when we talk about climate finance, for us, we're talking about the additional cost to deal with climate impacts, the additional cost to cooperate with the entire world and reduce emissions and move into a reality where we talk about green, sustainable growth, where just transition pathways are supported. So what we come here to talk about is needs and priorities, not because we don't have anything else that we would want to do. We would love to do science that demonstrates how developed countries owning up to the fair share can indeed work out a burden sharing arrangement and deliver on climate finance. We can do that kind of research if we had the opportunity to do that. But if you think about what is our priority, it's a question of what we do when it hits and what we do to avert it. And so when we get to talk about the NCQG then, our starting point is principles and values based on the convention. And the convention is very clear, Article 4 of the convention, that if we are to consider adequacy and scale, which I've heard of the mention of that a lot, it has to be from a context of what developed countries can deliver based on a burden-sharing approach, and it's actually there in the convention. When we come to the Paris Agreement, because we hear that it's a Paris Agreement goal, that's very true, but the Paris Agreement talks about how developed countries have got obligations in continuation with the mandates under the convention, and that's Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. So the question of scale for us is huge. We talked about the NDCs. We have NDCs that amount to $2 trillion in Africa. We can only raise about $288 billion US dollars. So what do we do when it comes to our ambition? What do we do when it comes to meeting the needs of African countries? And we look at the previous 100 billion regime, which is also until 2027, where we get the actual report of what we've seen, we get worried. Why? It was supposed to be 100 billion per year by 2020, then through to 2025. We're now seeing 100 and something billion, not per year, aggregatively. And so what this kind of finance does back at home is allow us continue with development while addressing the additional cost of climate change. And we may not want to talk about that, but that is exactly what it is. It's a lifeline for vulnerable countries. And so what we want to see in the NCQG, and I will respond to some of the things I've heard, what we want to see in the NCQG is that renewed leadership from developed countries. Because the political will is there. We've done a lot of policies back at home. Ask for an app. You will find countries that are struggling to put forward national adaptation plans. You ask for the NDC. Some of us have NDCs, but don't have financing flowing to the NDCs. So public finance is key. Public finance leverages private finance. That's what we can count. We can count grant equivalence. we can count what matters in the context of developing country needs, and for that matter, African states. And I can talk more to that when we get to the next segment.
Great, Julius, thank you. And I like your phrase there, renewed leadership from developed countries. I think those of us that scrutinise high-income countries have seen a stepping back, both on climate and on development. So I think that seems entirely right. So our last speaker before we get into some Q&A, I'm really pleased to have Carola Maya here, who's the coordinator for climate justice, transitions and the Amazon for Latindad, which is the Latin American network for economic and social justice. Thank you for being here. What is it that you hope will come out of the negotiations? And with reference to the points that Jonathan's raised about fair shares, are any of your members thinking about contributing climate finance yet, or is that case yet to be made?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not a negotiator, but I'm an observer in the process of the NCQG from the civil society. And with all respect, responding to your second question, if you consider that 81% of what Latin America receives as climate finance comes as loans, you will see that we are the ones really contributing to this climate finance effort, because we have to repay these debts, we have to repay these loans, and it's increasing our debt burdens, which are already high. 10 Latin American countries are already highly indebted, which is a big problem for us because it leads to a vicious circle of extractivism, debt, and the climate crisis is adding to these problems. And it is really, really unfair and completely contradictory to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is what we have been demanding in these spaces. We want climate justice, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities to be respected in the new collective quantified goal. And it's because it is because we know the reality and the impacts of the climate emergency. I work with a lot of people from the ground, from rural areas, rural farmers, indigenous communities that are losing everything they have. And it is really heartbreaking to see them fight every day because they cannot produce, they cannot live because they don't have water. The climate crisis is really, really affecting all of my country. Bolivia is the most vulnerable country in Latin America. And it is really, we are struggling a lot with an economic crisis, with a climate crisis. And we need this kind of negotiations to result in instruments and commitments that could be translated into real action. And we want climate finance to really help our countries and not to make our countries more indebted. And I would like to say also that, and I would like to use an example of a person that I met recently. She's a leader from an indigenous community in the Andean region. She's a producer, and she was telling me about all the problems they have in their land with the droughts, with the floodings, and with the melting of the glaciers, which is the source of water they have. All of their community is migrating because of this. We have lakes that have disappeared because of climate change. And this is going to be worse if we don't act now. And this person was participating in a workshop related to climate finance, and she heard that there is a commitment of 100 billion, there are climate funds, and she said, why aren't we accessing that money? Why don't we see a penny of that money? And I was so frustrated and sad to think, and I couldn't tell her and reply to her that Bolivia has only one project approved by the Green Climate Fund that took 5 years to be approved, that there are not direct access windows for this kind of communities and people that is suffering the impacts of the climate emergency. And that is why I think I'm here in the negotiations as civil society demanding a more ambitious climate finance goal, not only in quantity, but also in quality. We need public provision of grant-based climate finance that could respond to the real needs of developing countries, which are really struggling with this climate emergency. And we really need to see this commitment. And we hear every time that there is not enough public money to close this gap, but the money is there going to the war, going to fossil fuel subsidies, to sectors that are harming the people instead of helping. And I think we are really losing the time. We are in the last years to make the difference. Otherwise, we're going to be very late to respond. And what I would like to expect of this process is to have that, to have an answer for this lady that is part of our local community, that is aiming to find this help, this financial help that, according to what is the business as usual, is not going to get there, because the financial architecture right now is super ineffective, is creating more debt, it is really not responding to the needs, and we need to change these things, and that is why we are here to try to talk to our countries, to our negotiators, and try to raise these demands to make the climate finance, the new collective quantified goal process a success instead of a failure, because it has a lot of opportunities, but a lot of risks as well.
Great, thank you so much, Carola. And it's so interesting to hear some specific examples of people being directly affected. And I mean, it's interesting hearing the need to ensure impact, and then also for people to recognise, and actually feel that these large amounts of money are actually translating to something that matters in their lives. So that is a major challenge, I think. So let me now open up the floor to questions. We will be able to receive questions online, which will be fed up to me, and I will pass on to the panel. But we will start in the room. Yes, there's a roving mic coming to you. Gentleman in the centre here. Maybe if you could introduce yourself briefly and pose your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Axel Michael from University of Zurich and Perspectives Climate Research. My question goes to Svea. So you've criticized the weaknesses, and I myself 10 years ago with my wife wrote about the Rio markers and how love festivals in Belgium were notified as climate finance. So I fully subscribe to what you have been saying. But now getting into the messy world of the negotiators, how can we agree on a definition of climate finance? And if I'm now listening to the room, there's no real willingness to engage on the definition. So what landing zone would you see? Where could we at least improve somewhat from the current situation? Thank you.
Should I respond immediately?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I've been reading your papers and your chapters, and I think with the NCQG process, developing parties are asking for that, for a definition of climate finance. If you go through the submissions, you will see that they're asking for it, and you can see on the developed party countryside that there's at the moment no political will to take that up. And I think what people would say who've worked on the Standing Committee on Finance is that it's a very thorny question. It's unresolvable to an extent. And I've yesterday evening had a look at the last report of the Standing Committee on Finance, where they were trying to cluster definitions of climate finance to basically bring to the fore how difficult it is. But what I find interesting is that their proposals, they had 3 different proposals, was just going into the direction of what could be a sentence that's acceptable to all of us. And I looked at all the different versions of this one sentence that could be long or shorter, and I felt it would not address the problem. Because even if you had that definition, it would not solve the reporting and the accounting issues. So in my view, and I think it goes in the direction of what Ian said, it needs to be solved not so much under the umbrella of the UNFCCC, but more on the OECD side of things and under the NBBs. And I think what's been said yesterday also in the room at the TED is that the multilateral climate funds get a lot of praise for trying to get things right. I think there's problems with access, as you just said, but in terms of transparency, qualitative frameworks, and transporting and reporting, and I think they're way ahead. And I think it is with the OECD DAC to acknowledge these weaknesses. And at the moment, the incentives for them are pretty low because the current reporting makes them look good. And if it's self-reporting, what are the incentives to change that if it makes you look better if you double count or triple count the money? So I think the push needs to come from within the OECD DAC, and it needs to be also criticized, or I would encourage developing country parties to continue pushing for it. That would be my response. And as I then said, it becomes very technical, and I think we can discuss many of that later.
Yeah, Julius, do you want to come in on this as well?
Absolutely, yeah, if I may come in on this one. So we had the TED 10 yesterday, and one of the things we raised as an African group is the fact that what is not climate finance is counted as climate finance. And I agree with the 2 points around the definitions of climate finance. And this is the thing. So what is the purpose? And we do talk about the purpose of transparency in this process as one that does allow us to build trust. And what developing countries have asked for continually is that definition, because then that's the only way we can actually understand what goes into climate finance. And if we look at what that climate finance is doing in some more developing countries, things that are amazingly strange are being called climate finance. And we then ask the question, even with a limited scale, then what is supposed to be climate finance is actually not climate finance. And we have data to support that. And so in terms of going into the NCQG, the understanding only of what would be climate finance is not sufficient unless we go to the practice of counting climate finance. And we must agree on some principles. We must agree on what counts and what doesn't count as climate finance. And in the decision of the new collective quantified goal, agree that we will, to the extent possible, make mandatory what is in the section around underlying assumptions, definitions, and methodologies, and make that practical and possible by providing a set of expectations as what will be aggregately counted as contributing to climate finance. And I think that's one of the conversations that we are having at the developing country level. And just to say that.
I think there are a couple of issues here. There's the technical issue of how you count things. I guess the challenge with the DAC is that's the only people that define the DAC and ODA standards are the members of the DAC, which I guess is problematic. I've sometimes wondered about whether one other way to tackle it at a political level is to invite the recipient to say whether something is climate finance and to only count it if that exists. I mean, there's a power dynamic there, but maybe that's a different way to approach it. Let's open up for another round of questions, and maybe Ed can remind me how online participants can pose their questions in the text, and I'll just remind them. Who else? There's a gentleman at the back there. Just introduce yourself briefly and pose your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Eliab Figueroa. I used to work in Peru for a project related to biodiversity finance. And therefore, it was very interesting for me to hear about the Latin America amount of debt, right? Our colleague was mentioning that 81% of the climate finance in Latin America accounts to debt. And therefore, I wanted to ask, what's your stance of the panel in general on how this debt is being used? Because what I see here as a dichotomy is that the debt that governments are taking, or the loans that governments are taking, should be used as leveraging the private sector funds. On one hand, we have a need of a lot of money, trillions of dollars that are needed to address climate finance. On the other hand, we had only very little grant-based available resources. How can we use that and potentiate it with loans? How can we say, instead of increasing that, let's leverage that? And I think there are some examples with the GCF or with the different multilateral donors fund for the Amazon. And that's why I wanted to hear. Probably there's something similar in Africa as well.
Great. Let's just take another question as well. And Carola, maybe I'll turn to you first on that one and see who else wants to talk. Lady here.
Yes, hi everybody. Liane Schaletek from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Very interesting discussion. Picks up a lot of topics that we've heard in previous TEDs and are curious to see how they're going to be resolved in the ad hoc working program. I have a question that goes a little bit to the connection between development finance and climate finance, the global financial architecture. And obviously from developed country side, there is a lot of interest to think it broader, the Article 2.1c, the onion, the multiple layers. But when we are talking a lot about what has to shift in the UNFCCC regime, and that has been a lot of focus here in terms of the contributor base, the component that would be corresponding would be what has to shift in the, for example, multilateral bank regime, where we are seeing a lot of inertias from the same developed country that are challenging the contributor base in the UNFCCC regime, for example, to tackle governance issues, to tackle issues of debt relief. And so I think if one calls for an expansion of the contributor base in the UNFCCC regime, then one would also have to call for an expansion of special drawing rights or an increased governance for the exact same country that you want to hold accountable for providing more climate finance. And would be very interested to hear, including from some of the research that the Center for Global Development has done, how those issues of governance reform, SDR expansion go into the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's take those two, and Heike, maybe I'll ask you to say something about that second one in a moment, as well as perhaps Jonathan. But first, this question of leveraging and making more of the lending. Carola, do you want to take that first?
Yes. Well, first, thank you for the question. It is obvious that most of climate finance is going to mitigation projects, especially if they are loans, because they have to be repaid, so you need profit to make this repayment. And this is not what we need. We need adaptation finance, because we are, as I mentioned, suffering from these climate impacts. And adaptation finance is only 28% of the total climate finance. So I think the approach of leveraging public money to the risk, this private investment, is not the adequate, because private investors are not going to have the solution for adaptation, to close this adaptation gap that we have, because they are moved by this desire to create profit for them. And adaptation projects and loss and damage that for us should go inside this new climate finance goal is not going to provide that for them. So I don't agree with that perspective of the cascade approach, which is promoted by the MDBs, and that is something that we criticize. And to reply to Lian about the SDRs, Latindad has been very active in promoting the allocation of special drawing rights after the pandemic. And we see, and we are trying to propose in these kind of spaces, the use a new allocation of special drawing rights to close the financial gap we have, and also for the SDGs. Because it is a political decision, it doesn't create debt. We have analyzed what happened with the first 650 billion SDRs that were allocated after the pandemic. 2/3 were distributed to the global north, 1/3 to the global south, because it responds, unfortunately, to the voting power within the IMF board. But for the 1/3 that came to our countries was very useful, and countries have the sovereign right to decide where to allocate these resources. So it was a decision of a very fast decision, very effective. So we are trying to propose negotiators and people in these kind of spaces to include a new allocation of special drawing rights as a new mechanism for climate finance. And of course, I agree with Lian that we are also pushing for a reform in this international financial system that has demonstrated to be neo-colonial, unfair, and it's been its governance relies in the same climate debtors that are trying to block these more ambitious decisions within the UNFCCC negotiations.
Thank you. Heike, can I turn to you? You mentioned reform of the international system in your opening remarks, and I wonder if you can pick up on Lian's question about SDRs and how that fits in the negotiation, and what what a changed contributor base could mean in that context.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to grab your mic, but then I realized I have one. So this was my strange reaction. Yeah, I mean, this is an important point. Also, the global framework conditions, so not only in country, and to be ambitious there as well. It's the MDB reform. I'm trying to make eye contact with Lilian. It's the MDB reform, IMF, certainly. It's the debt structure, but it goes also beyond innovative sources of finance. And I think the tricky thing with negotiations is when we discuss it, on the one hand, okay, what is our influence as UNFCCC on these processes? We can highly recommend or ask for, but the UNFCCC process is not the one deciding. That is like one key element that makes it a bit tricky. The second one is sometimes coming from colleagues, you want to deflect the discussion from the core UNFCCC things with talking about the MDB reform and so on. So these are a bit different or difficult questions. But I think we have to address all of those, and from the German perspective, being active in the MDB or the World Bank evolution, trying to really look honestly into innovative sources of finance, together with Brazil, South Africa, and I think Spain, if I remember correctly, our minister is calling strongly for a new tax on billionaires, high income, so really to create also new sources of income. I don't want to shy away from the question of STRs. You might know there's a complex position of the German government on this, but this is something that we also have to look into again and again. So I agree on this. Just one last remark on loan. I don't want to, but the question came up several times. I fully agree we cannot increase debt with climate finance. That is not fair. But I think also on loans for different countries and different programs, we have also to have a differentiated analysis and approach. And just to highlight one thing, I cannot argue why a highly profitable and renewable energy investment on a very concessional loan should be a grant. So, but of course, grants for LDCs on adaptation, for example, or loss and damage, I totally get the point. But we need differentiation there in a world not only that is scarce of resources, but where we have also to convince taxpayers, voters on the rationality of what we are doing. So I think they are very relevant points, but we have to differentiate and be evidence-based also there.
Great, thank you. I wonder if I could just follow up on that, because in your opening remarks, you mentioned the possible onion structure that there might be, and then there is this question of core public resources versus mobilising and transforming the international financial system so that it supports climate action. Do you think the onion structure is too ambitious? Do you think we should have a potentially three, we've got 6 months to go, is agreeing on 3 figures, if it's a quantified goal for each of the layers, say, is that realistic? Is that too much? I'm interested in Julius's position on this as well. Is the onion proposal realistic, and should we be focusing more on a kind of core public element?
From my perspective, it's more realistic to have a holistic and multi-layered approach and objectives. Because either way, if I would argue for a goal that focuses on the private sector contribution only, I wouldn't get agreement from colleagues, and I fully get it. But the other way, from substance, but also from interest and negotiators' standpoint. But the other way around as well, public funding alone, we all know, will not do the job. And also it's political, so also there are different interests involved. So I think it might be easier, and I was hinting, or not even only hinting, at Montreal and the GBF outcome. So it might be easier to get a multi-layered objective even.
Great, thank you. Julius, do you want to come in on that, and then I'll open up again for some questions from the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Paris Agreement takes care of a lot of things, and one of the things that it takes care of is what this process stands to do in the context of the interconnected nature of the financial flows in the world. And that's Article 2.1c. And what Article 9 takes care of is the support needed through provision and mobilization to meet the needs of developing countries in implementing direct climate action. And this is through what we've been asked to prepare, the nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans. And I think we need to be very careful about what it is that we're talking about, in my view. So if you think about a multi-layered goal, you're thinking about things that actually go beyond what we have within the context of needs of developing countries, which are additional needs due to the climate burden. And if you think about 21C, then it takes you to where we can actually have conversations on the reforms we need within the multilateral financial system. We can talk about it there. We can talk about the interconnected nature of that with development, with economic plans. We can talk about that, the interconnected nature of that with the fiscal space and the many things that we have to consider as countries to meet both our development and climate challenges, including what we talk about hugely, signaling the private sector and all that. So I think it's a question of, are we really thinking of transforming the world through Article 9, or putting in place safeguards for countries that need climate finance to ensure that they have that climate finance going where it's needed, supporting the additionality through public as the core, and a mobilization goal, which is leveraging. So we have to talk about the leveraging ratio. And coming to this, we've seen the USD $100 billion report saying that whatever you mobilize as public finance is only, whatever you provide as public finance is only mobilizing a very small share of private sector finance. Why is there leveraging inertia? Those are the things we need to talk about in the NCQG. So we need to ask the question, how do we increase public support in a way that can also allow other public interventions to leverage private financing, and we have a goal that is a quantum that actually meets the NDC implementation ambition. And that's why we have over the different COPs, COP27, COP28, particularly COP28, focused the finance on the implementation of something. And that's the NDCs and the NAPs. And so if we go talking about the MDBs, there's so much, in my view, that we can do in terms of signaling within Article 2.1c that we cannot do within the Article 9, and that's the practicality of this. And so what we're asking for as African states in this matter is the assurance that there's public support that mobilizes a target, which is private sector support, that we can account through the agreed enhanced transparency framework, and that we can then proceed to asking, while we are sure that we can meet our climate impacts, the question of how do we transform the global financial architecture. And there are solutions being worked out on this side that we can only speak to or signal to a certain level, but that requires an overall discussion. And I haven't even talked about the kind of challenges we are seeing now through Article 2.1c. For example, the application of the CBAM by the EU and its implication on African states, if done in a way that does not consider African needs. The unilateral measures, we call them. We haven't even talked about that just yet. And you have to see then that African countries are being forced hugely into a situation where they are being asked to take on loans to address climate change. We have the IMFs and the World Banks coming in and putting a conditionality on what we can access from those institutions based on our climate risk now. And that's a 2.1c conversation. And it's a huge problem already. So I think it's a moral and a principle-based conversation that we must have. So what exactly do we want to do in a way that allows all of us get to a reality of 1.5 degrees, enhanced adaptive capacities, and resilience?
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take one more round of questions in the room. I haven't got any coming in online, and then we will also give our panelists a chance to sum up before we conclude. So I've got 3 colleagues here, lady at the back there, one in the middle, and gentleman in front. If we take those 3 in a row, lady in the red in the second to last row. Just introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Hilary. I am from Christian Aid. This is a question for Jonathan. Thank you so much for your research. I think it's really useful. I'm just thinking about, in terms of the practicality of your proposition in the context of a negotiation that is going to conclude by the end of this year. I guess the thing is that the Paris Agreement is already clear about developed countries, and it's one country taking the lead and others in a position to do so, to provide voluntarily. So what is your proposition in terms of how to reflect issues a fair share? Do you have a vision for how this could be reflected in the NCQG decision? What do we do with this in the next 6 months ahead of us? Thank you.
We'll just take all three questions and then we'll come to the panel. So it was just a lady here in the black top.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for this panel. It's been really fun to engage. My name is Lily. I'm a negotiator with the U.S. delegation working closely with Julius on solving this thorny problem. I really welcome the discussion we've been having on impact of climate finance. And Heike, I think your opening point on how it's important to make sure that this goal is not that finance is not kind of a goal in and of itself, but rather that we're thinking about the impacts the finance might have. And I believe you spoke to this as well, Svea. And I'd be curious for both of you and anyone else on the panel to speak a little bit more about how we might measure those impacts and how we might see those reflected in the goal. I think it's been something we've been grappling with as negotiators and would really welcome input on that point. Since I think many of the kind of indicators, especially when you get into adaptation, pose a lot of challenges and are very kind of nascent, and we're trying to figure out how to kind of square that circle in the goal. So thanks again. And I think you were next.
And Tan Copsey, communications consultant. My question is to the panel, but not to the mouse we just saw behind the stage. Seriously.
Don't unnerve the panel.
Which is, what's the one thing you would like to see outside of the process that might unlock progress on the NCQG in negotiations?
Great question, that. Thank you. So let's come to Jonathan first, and then Svea on the first two, and then we'll see who wants to take on that last question. Jonathan.
Sure. No, thanks, Hilary. Look, this isn't going to be easy. This isn't going to be easy at all. The Paris Agreement at least drops references to the annex categories, and as I understand it, opinions differ, or people take different positions on the extent to which that releases some countries from the obligations of the UNFCCC. It seems to me that there is nothing preventing countries from contributing climate finance. You could argue that the UAE's commitment to provide $100 million to the Loss and Damage Fund at COP28 was an example of that. Ultimately, language will need to be found that facilitates, that encourages. I'm doubtful, to be honest, that putting it as an obligation is going to be feasible, and even if it were desirable, I just don't think that's going to happen. But finding language that acknowledges the contributions that have already been made, that encourages further contributions, that makes it a collective responsibility from the non-Annex II countries. I don't think there's any merit in singling out individual countries, even if some of the analysis makes it clear that some should. There can be references to those that have contributed the most to emissions. Language like that is general, one gets the drift, but doesn't single out individual groups or individual countries. This has been tried before. I'm under no illusion that this isn't going to be difficult. Ultimately, and I said this yesterday, it's not binary. And I worry that the debate has become very binary in terms of developed versus developing. There is a spectrum. We're all countries at some point on that spectrum. And I suppose this comes back to the very last question. What's the one thing? I would love to see a recognition that we have to find a solution to this, or we are in serious trouble, and that everybody does have a contribution and a responsibility to make. And if we can find a form of words and a way of expressing it that recognizes and acknowledges that, and stimulates and encourages the kind of contributions that are needed, then there is still, then we're making progress. Whether that can be done by the end of this year for the NCQG, I don't know. But goodness me, we have to try. And coming back to some of the earlier comments, I mean, ultimately, I recognize completely that there are concerns that this debate is being used to try and diminish the responsibility of developed countries. In my view, nothing could be further than the truth. It's clear that everybody needs to step up. There's some other work that we did. I called it an inconvenient truth, actually, trying to quantify the kind of financial requirements needed. And whichever way you cut it, in lots of different ways, whether it's based on needs, whether it's based on responsibility, whether it's based on climate justice. I mean, the numbers are eye-watering. And we need to find a way that acknowledges that and just encourages everybody as countries to contribute.
Thanks, Jonathan. Svea, I wonder if we could turn to you on the impact question. I'd also, maybe Heike has a perspective on that. And I'm just going to, if you don't mind, pose you one of the online questions as well, which I think follows on what you've said. Can the panel comment on countries double counting climate and development finance? What's the motivation for doing this, and what rules should be changed to stop it?
Maybe I start with that one first. I think the motivation is straightforward to have more money. I mean, for towards the 0.7 and more money towards the 100 billion goal. I think that's obvious. And I think the practice as such lends itself to double counting because you can use the real marker twice or 3 times, so that basically doubles up the money. As I said, what could be done about it is to discontinue this practice and to have, when you report a project, one principal objective and have more granularity introduced. And to then, I think then is another discussion whether this should then be outside of ODA or inside. I think there you can have different views. In my view, they're not even, it's not so important even if it's outside of ODA or inside. I think the separation is more important than whether it's outside or inside. It could even be inside ODA, but be made more transparent. I think that's the most important point. And with regards to impact, to simplify the situation, I think what we have at the moment is the coding problem at the OECD DAC level. I think it's done better at the MDB level. That's, I think, a little bit the status we're having. But both lack the measurement of impacts, basically, and the link to impacts. And I think this could be even done jointly. I don't think any institution needs to work it out how it could be done. I think they could even do that jointly as donors are engaged in MDBs and in the OECD DAC. And I think at the heart of it is that we go away from reporting at aggregate level. We need to have this data at project level to be able to do that and have this data included. And with regards to mitigation, it's about the expected impact on greenhouse gas emission reduction, and then also to measure against that how impactful these projects have been. And I think we need to have much more evidence if it was successful or not. And in particular, with regards to adaptation, I think we know even less. And I think it comes to what you just said, Carola, we know even less how to better get the money to the people who need it. And I think just one last point on the big thing that you just mentioned on that the breakthrough in the negotiations. And I'm not one of the persons who've been in the UN negotiations for years and years, so it might be overly positive or maybe too naive, I don't know. But my observation is that it often, the breakthroughs happen at the last minute. So for example, with the loss and damage fund, it was the EU negotiating, and then at the moment realizing we won't get any further unless we agree to the loss and damage fund. And I think in this case, I would just encourage developed country parties to not wait until the last minute, to basically think of what could be an agreeable definition of climate finance they could live with, what could be a change reporting practice they could live with, and not just basically sit it out and hope that it will just disappear or dissolve or handle it at the minister level at the last minute. This would just be my idea on this.
Yeah, I mean, trust is such a big thing. You know, this is an agreement with 196 countries, and so to not have the fundamental currency defined seems, you know, not a basis for trust. Heike, I wonder if I can also pose to you, as well as the impact question that we've had, that you might want to comment on. How do you ensure impact? We've got an online question saying, how can the quality of climate finance be improved? And, for example, the integrity of climate offsets being traded. So your views on impact and anything on the quality of climate finance.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also excellent questions and remarks coming from the audience and, of course, the panelists. On impact, I fully acknowledge the challenges there. Svea also mentioned those and ways not to go to it with every single institution and have really a more granular approach. But I mentioned just one main challenge that I see in the area where I see we should do more is this programmatic and policy-based approach. And there, talking to our evaluators and IDOS and others, we are told, you cannot tell the impact of the getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies that directly. The way is so long. So our programs, energy policy-based financing, for example, doesn't have a ton of CO2 then that is counted. But nevertheless, not maybe every single one of these operations is, but nevertheless highly impactful. So there is, from my perspective, a main challenge for what I want to see more, but we cannot really have indicators on the impact directly and easily. On the offsets, this is a really challenging topic where, so many people are talking about the potential from different aspects. Also, many countries from the global south, forest countries, for example, have high hopes for billions coming into their budgets. But the German perspective is really that we have to foremost make sure that the transparency and the integrity of what is happening in these programs is safeguarded. So, and the ambition of the companies engaged or countries engaged, depending on what kind of Article 6 or whatever operation you are in. So this is no easy way out to generate new funds. There are so many obstacles we have to take care of, and still even in the developed countries group, there are different perspectives on how to go about offsets.
Right, thank you. And I mean, just on the impact question, maybe I could add as well. Colleagues on the panel alluded to this earlier, but CGD has done some work looking at the 3IE database of high quality evaluations. You know, these are impact assessments, and climate is massively underrepresented there. And I think there's quite a lot that providers and recipients can do to work together to come up with common measures of impact, to coordinate evaluation, and to learn about what works well. And I think that's a big agenda as the amount of climate finance grows. I've got another couple of questions from online, and then I'm also going to ask our panelists to give us their concluding remarks. So one question I'm going to answer, why did the OECD say that the 100 billion has been met if money isn't new and additional? When and how did the decision to do so happen? There's been a good elaboration about this from Joe Thwaites on Twitter recently, if you want to have a look. The question of whether the 100 billion target was new and additional, I think, is contested. I think the answer to how 100 billion has been achieved, I mean, I think partly our work has shown that, as people mentioned earlier, the share of GNI that provider countries are giving in aid and in development finance in general has stayed relatively constant. So I think we've seen about 2/3 of the 100 billion accounted for by just growth in economies and by inflation. And then the remaining third, or maybe more, has been a diversion or a relabeling of existing development efforts. And I think there's a big question for negotiators. If we end up with another face value climate finance goal, I think we'll see a similar pattern. And I wonder whether there's a case for looking at the share of GNI incrementally rising, even if that's difficult. The final question I wanted to come to from online, which I think is a great one and connects to quality, I guess, is panelists' views on how to ensure climate finance is directed to women-led and women-centred solution in lower income countries. So I'd be grateful for our panelists' views on that. And I will also ask them to each make some concluding remarks, perhaps respond to the question about what needs to happen outside of COP if you haven't already answered that question. Svea, I'm going to make life difficult for you and come to you first. So anything on women-led approaches and whether and how we incorporate that, and any final remarks on what you want to see from the negotiations?
Sorry, the first was on what? I didn't.
Women-led approaches. How do we incorporate that in the new goal?
To be honest, I'm not an expert on that, so I'd rather refrain from saying something that doesn't make sense. But I think we do have an expert here in the room, so I'd love to hear her voice. On concluding remarks, I think I already reflected on my main point when I responded to your question about the big thing and the breakthrough, so I would just pass it on to Jonathan.
Thank you. I think, to me, I've already said that this matters enormously. Ian, you mentioned the word trust, and I think that is absolutely critical in this process. To the extent that, I've argued already, there is a case for expanding the contributor base, there has to be, it seems to me, some kind of movement, some kind of concession, some kind of change from the existing set of donors. I think getting clarity on the climate definitions is really, really important. The transparency point is really, really important. And honouring existing promises is absolutely essential. We did some other work last year looking at the extent to which, or rather the role of climate finance in itself helping to facilitate the UNFCCC process and make ambitions regarding reducing, or targets regarding reducing emissions more ambitious than they would otherwise have been. And even with a set of quite conservative assumptions, you can argue that the impact of climate finance, this indirect impact of climate finance, in terms of making net zero targets more ambitious, is maybe worth 10 times more than the direct impact of investments in mitigation programs. So it really, really matters. But that indirect impact will only be realized if there is trust in the process and if promises are kept. So to me, that's a really, really important point. And the comparability point is really important too. We can talk about fair shares, but if different donors are reporting their climate finance using different methodologies, then it becomes impossible to compare what one country is providing to another. And unless there is some consistent methodology or a facility to adapt and adjust what donors report, then we're not much further along the road in terms of being able to assess whether contributions are fair enough. Yeah, so those would be my main points. And that last, sorry, your last question again. I mean, I just think we need a mindset change. I have been. This is going slightly off-piste, slightly off a little bit. But to me, one of the most powerful sessions or messages that came out of the last COP was coming back to some of the climate science and the tipping points. And the risk that we collectively face that some of these tipping points will be breached, and then we are in genuinely difficult, dangerous territory. But at the same time, there was a lot of positive reporting around the technological and behavioral tipping points that at least give us some grounds for optimism, certainly hope, that we can get there. But whichever way you look at it, it's this them and us discussion just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. This has to be a collective effort. And that's the sort of mindset change that I would love to see happening outside as well as inside the UNFCCC process.
Thank you. Julius.
I think the reason why it becomes a question of them and us is because of how important the climate discussion is to our politics and to our economies and to the social realities of our lives. And when you introduce the word economics, then there are those who want to gain on the backs of others, unfortunately. We have the Reuters report talking about $18 billion in loans being made by developed countries from developing countries, loans at market rate loan rates, and to address climate change. And colleagues, during Paris, we had one thing in common: make the world safer, make the world better for everybody. And we agreed on principles and values. We agreed on a mechanism that would ensure we get there. And not more than 10 years now, we are talking about changing the rules and terms of engagement? Is it because climate is no longer a priority for the world? Absolutely no. But maybe it's because within the current contexts, some feel we don't necessarily need to talk about the how. We are more comfortable with making sure that we are relevant within where we live. And this is how the politics and the economics are finding their way in the climate problem. And unfortunately, that is very jeopardizing for countries that have no opportunity to address it heads on because they need the support they require. They are faced by climate calamities that they cannot even go beyond. And so these are the countries that find themselves in the middle of all these political and economic narratives. So what do we communicate? We have to be truthful. Is it about survival or is it about convenience? We must do it because it's about survival for all humanity. When I talked about renewed leadership, I meant it because then what we are asked is the finance we can provide or the new NCQG is a question of who contributes and who receives the money. It's not a question of how much we need to transform this world and address the climate crisis. It's not a question of needs and priorities. It's not a question of how much we need to move us from vulnerability to adaptive capacities to resilience anymore, unfortunately. And so what we need to communicate is the climate crisis will not wait for us to solve our political challenges. And that then requires renewed political leadership to maneuver through the intricacies between politics and economies, and economics as well. And when it comes to that, for a country like Kenya and the African group, we go back to the sole purpose of why we talk about the collective, which is we can do something, all of us. But those who cannot do more than the others have to be facilitated to get where the ones who are actually able to do more are able to equally demonstrate impact and effectiveness and all the many words that we want to use. And so for me, it's about this process being balanced enough to allow us to talk about the change we need as countries who need it and as countries who've already gone above and before the others from an equal footing, and the principles come in. And so we look forward to an NCQG that understands and appreciates our realities and that puts into perspective the needs of countries and that asks the question, how do we stepwise get to a level where we offer assurance, even when the world might be crumbling, we are still standing united for vulnerable communities.
Right, thanks, Julia. So it's a powerful idea, the idea of, NDCs that are more comprehensive, that connect to, that demonstrate the needs, and that connects to the amounts that are discussed and agreed at the coming negotiations. Carola, your final remarks and responses to the outstanding questions.
Yes, well, thank you so much first for the invitation. Climate finance should be new and additional to existing commitments, ODAs and existing commitments. It should be additional, and we need an agreed definition, but also I agree with Jonathan, we need one methodology to measure it. Otherwise, we are not going to have transparency, and we need trust in this kind of spaces, multilateral spaces. Otherwise, we're not going to move to a better future. And what we need, and I expect for this process is political will to really solve the problem as an emergency, because it is an emergency, and the survival of millions of people is on risk. It is not something so simple. It is really, really important matter that we need to solve, and we need to solve it with real solutions. Carbon markets, for example, for us, it is not a real solution. It's not going to solve the climate crisis, and we need to find fast, efficient, and accessible ways to guarantee these trillions. We know that we need trillions, not the $100 billion we had as a goal. So how can we find these kind of instruments or measures without increasing indebtedness in our countries, without increasing inequalities? We can find tax justice instruments, for example, taxing the rich people, the big fossil fuel corporations. There are some proposals out there. Also, why don't we think about debt relief initiatives? Germany was benefited after the war with debt relief to reconstruct the country. And now we need that. There are 60 countries that are highly indebted, highly vulnerable to the climate crisis, that really need this kind of support. Debt relief could free up a lot of resources, fiscal resources, that could be very useful to tackle the climate emergency. We also need this kind of other mechanisms outside the UNFCCC common instruments, as new allocation of special drawing rights with different criteria of distribution that prioritizes needs and vulnerability and climate vulnerability of our countries and for the people. And we need to guarantee that this new goal is going to respond to real needs of especially most vulnerable communities. As I mentioned, in my country, there are millions of people that are really struggling, that cannot access this money. So we really need to respond to their needs, make it fast, create more direct access windows, and mostly, and I agree with you, we need to guarantee the provision of grant-based public finance, especially for adaptation, loss and damage. Mitigation efforts, yes, maybe we can, but highly concessional finance is important there. And this kind of qualities that what we want, and we are trying to promote to also learn from the mistakes from the previous goal. There are many things to learn, and we need to reform this financial architecture, considering that the problems are different now. The realities are really responding to a multiple crisis that is affecting unfairly the most vulnerable communities, that are the ones that haven't contributed to this climate emergency, and that unfortunately are the ones that really are struggling with this. So we want to see this political will. We want the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities to be respected. As Julius was saying, the Article 9 establishes that rich countries need to mobilize money to developing countries to help them tackle the emergency. So why are we discussing different things? Why are we trying to dilute this historical responsibility if it's clear that we have to set a more ambitious goal and to respond to these needs that are really can becoming even higher every time as time passes?
Thank you. And you mentioned at the start there about the new additional finance. I mean, I do find it, I mean, why would we have a huge negotiating process to negotiate over finance if it wasn't new and additional? I mean, what would be the whole point of that? It's kind of, it's self-evident, I think. And it's in the language going back, you know, to at least Rio, that climate finance would be new and additional. And I think if we don't tackle that, the trust issue is broken. I just wanted to have one final comment from me before I pass to Heike to give her final remarks. On, I think the other thing we haven't mentioned that's outside of the COP process that matters is the IDA replenishment. So I think that is, you know, the World Bank and IDA are the biggest funders of climate finance, and they are also, the IDA replenishment, I think, is critical to the wider reforms at the multilateral development banks that we need to see. So I think there are connections outside of COP, even if that won't be a central part of the negotiation. Heike, let me pass to you for your final remarks, and then we will close.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would also like to take the opportunity to answer at least to one question that was not addressed yet on the women and vulnerable groups. Not that I have the whole answer, but it's very important for us. And I think we really have to have a structural and integrated approach to increase participation, empowerment in the institutions when decisions are made in the Green Climate Fund. We tried it in the loss and damage discussions. Was challenging, but really to have a more inclusive and empowering approach that vulnerable communities in the decision making and then also in the instruments that get money out are really participating in a meaningful way. And of course, the second question about the big thing that needs to happen to make things happen is a challenging one, because I think all of us can see the difficult geopolitics and political situations we face that are not in favor of an ambitious momentum, neither for ambitious NDCs, ambitious financing. So it's a challenging time, but we need, like Jonathan said, the global perspective and the joint vision that we only can make progress together. So on my takeaways, my first is it's really always good to talk and hear different perspectives, although, again, we might not have agreed on everything, but it's a step further in understanding. And I heard also a lot of common ground. I don't know if Jonathan and Julius see it likewise, but between Jonathan, Julius, and even myself, between Carola and Julius on the perspective on African countries I would assume be part of the 116 countries you mentioned that should not contribute to this discussion. And that vulnerable communities, political climate is helpful because we get questions that are not fair, but are based on the transparency that we provide. But the thing that I really struggle with is with the separation of development and climate, and the only narrative that is here about double counting it makes. So how could I sort renewable energy investment in climate only? Is it development? And just the second thing, agriculture. Yeah, I would claim, it's not fair, but I would claim every agriculture project has to have climate in it. If not, it's not a good project. How can it be what we know about climate impacts? Water, I could say, so I'm really struggling with it. I get the notion of we need to be fair and transparent, additional finance, and we need more climate and development finance. I personally fully agree. But it's too easy to say separated and no, two real markers from my perspective. But really let us work on the common ground and make it an ambitious finance goal that serves climate justice, where the atmosphere doesn't stop counting emissions that came from countries that are not on the list in 1992. Because I think the atmosphere counts all emissions, and let's generate also financial contributions for African and vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries from all sources.
Great, Heike, thank you. There's such a mix of technical and political challenges in this agenda. There's plenty of sessions scheduled in the coming fortnight for the ad hoc working group to try and make progress on these issues. I hope we've shed a little bit more light and moved us forward a little bit with this discussion. I wonder if you join me in thanking our panel for their time, and we look forward to continuing this discussion informally afterwards. Thanks, everybody.
Great moderation.